Apache warrior saved a settler widow from outlaws. Unaware, she carried his brother's child. He saved a woman's life without knowing she carried his brother's child, and the truth would destroy everything he thought he knew about honor. The October wind carried the scent of dying grass and distant smoke across the Kansas plains, whispering secrets that Aiyana had learned to read like tracks in dried mud. His paint horse moved beneath him with the fluid grace of water over stone, hooves finding purchase on earth that had drunk the blood of too many wars. 2 winters had passed since his brother Nailnish vanished like morning mist, leaving behind only questions and a grief that sat heavy in Aiyana's chest like swallowed stones. He rode the borderlands now, that invisible line where white settlements pressed against Apache territory like competing tides. His people called him foolish for seeking ghosts among the wooden houses and fenced fields, but something deeper than logic pulled him toward these edges of 2 worlds. Perhaps it was hope. Perhaps it was the simple need to know whether his brother lived or had returned to the earth that birthed them both. The first gunshot cracked across the afternoon like a branch breaking under winter's weight. Aiyana's horse ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring at the scent of gunpowder carried on the restless wind. A second shot followed, then a third, and he knew the sound of desperation when he heard it. Not the measured reports of hunting or practice, but the wild firing of men who had found something they wanted and would kill to keep it. He urged his mount toward a low rise crowned with scrub oak, moving with the careful silence his grandfather had taught him before his voice could properly form words. At the ridge's crest, he dismounted and crawled forward on his belly until the scene below spread out like a painting done in dust and violence. 3 white men surrounded a cabin that squatted against the prairie like a wounded animal. Smoke rose from its chimney in a thin, hopeful line that seemed to mock the chaos unfolding in its shadow. The men moved with the predatory confidence of wolves who had found injured prey, their horses stamping and snorting with the excitement of their riders. But it was a woman who drew Aiyana's attention like iron to a lodestone. She stood in the cabin's doorway with a rifle clutched in hands that trembled despite their firm grip. Even from this distance, he could see the proud line of her shoulders and the defiant tilt of her chin. Her dress, once blue as a summer sky, now bore the stains of hard living and harder choices. But it was her condition that made Aiyana's breath catch in his throat like a hooked fish. She was heavy with child, her belly round and full beneath the faded fabric. 7, maybe 8 months along, if he guessed right, and she faced 3 armed men with nothing but courage and a rifle that shook in her grip. "Come on out, Sarah," called the largest of the men, his voice carrying the false sweetness of spoiled honey. "We ain't here to hurt you none. Just want to talk business." "I got nothing to talk about. Gideon Hayes," she called back, and her voice carried across the distance like a bell struck true. "You and your boys best ride on before someone gets hurt." The man called Hayes laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Someone's gonna get hurt all right, but it don't have to be you or that baby you're carrying." He spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Your husband ain't coming back to protect you, Sarah. Word is he got himself killed playing at being a white man." "Shame that." The woman's rifle wavered, and Aiyana saw her free hand move instinctively to her belly. Whatever Hayes had said had struck deeper than any bullet could. "Now," Hayes continued, his voice turning hard as winter iron, "you can make this easy, or you can make it hard. But either way, we're taking what we came for. That deed your husband left you, and anything else that might be worth having." Aiyana had heard enough. He slid backward from the ridge and returned to his horse, checking his weapons with the automatic precision of a man who had learned early that hesitation was death's closest friend. His rifle was loaded, his knife sharp enough to shave with, and his bow strung with sinew that had never failed him. But more than weapons, he carried the accumulated weight of Apache warfare, the knowledge that victory belonged not to the strongest but to the wisest. The approach took him 15 minutes of careful movement through gullies and scrub brush, using every fold in the land to mask his presence. When he was close enough to count the flies buzzing around the outlaws' horses, He notched an arrow and drew his bow with the fluid motion of water, finding its level. The first arrow took Hayes in the shoulder, spinning him around like a child's top, and sending his revolver flying into the dust. The second found the chest of a thin man with nervous eyes, dropping him before he could clear leather. The third man, younger than the others and quicker on his feet, managed to fire 2 wild shots before Aiyana's knife found the space between his ribs with surgical precision. Silence fell over the homestead like a burial shroud, broken only by Hayes' labored breathing and the distant cry of a hawk riding the afternoon thermals. Aiyana moved among the fallen men with the careful attention of a hunter checking his snares, ensuring that death had claimed those it was meant to claim and that the wounded could do no more harm. Sarah McKenna still stood in her doorway, the rifle now hanging loose in her grip as she stared at the Apache warrior who had emerged from the prairie like an answer to unspoken prayers. Her eyes were green as spring grass and wide with shock, but Aiyana saw no fear there. Only a kind of weary recognition, as if she had been expecting this moment without knowing it. "Ma'am," he said in careful English, the words feeling strange on his tongue after so long speaking only his native language. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head slowly, her gaze moving from the dead men to their rescuer and back again. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and lost more than she could afford. "They're dead. 2 of them. The third won't be using that shoulder for anything useful anytime soon." Aiyana gestured toward Hayes, who had crawled behind a water trough and was making small, pained sounds like a wounded animal. "He'll live, if he's smart enough to ride away and never come back." Sarah nodded, as if this made perfect sense, as if Apache warriors regularly appeared to solve her problems with arrows and steel. She lowered the rifle completely and stepped out of the cabin's shadow, moving with the careful dignity of a woman carrying precious cargo. "I'm grateful," she said simply. "More grateful than I can say." Up close, Aiyana could see the lines that worry and hardship had etched around her eyes, the way her hands trembled not with fear, but with exhaustion. She was younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 25, but life on the frontier had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with years. "You're alone out here?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "My husband died last spring." The words came out flat and final, like stones dropped into still water. "Haven't seen another soul in 3 weeks, until today." Aiyana felt something twist in his chest, a familiar ache that reminded him of his own losses. This is no place for a woman alone. Especially not. He gestured carefully toward her condition. "Especially not carrying a half-breed baby." "You mean?" The words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment he could only stare at her. She met his gaze steadily, chin raised in defiance or resignation. He couldn't tell which. "I didn't mean, it's all right," she said quietly. "I know what people see when they look at me now. What they think." Her hand moved to her belly again, protective and tender. "But he was a good man, my Thomas. The best man I ever knew. Whatever color his skin was under that white man's name he wore." The wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of approaching weather and something else that Aiyana couldn't quite name. Something that made the hair on his neck stand up and his heart beat faster with a recognition he didn't understand. He looked at Sarah McKenna, really looked at her, taking in the proud curve of her mouth and the stubborn set of her shoulders. Something about her face tugged at his memory, like a fishhook, some half-remembered dream or distant echo that refused to come clear. "Thomas," he repeated softly, testing the name on his tongue. "Thomas McKenna. That's what he called himself when we married. Said his real name was too hard for white folks to say proper." She smiled then, the first real smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face into something almost beautiful. But sometimes when he thought I was sleeping, I'd hear him whisper it to himself in the dark, like a prayer or a song. The world seemed to tilt around Aiyana, the familiar landscape shifting like sand in a windstorm. He opened his mouth to ask the question that was burning in his throat like swallowed fire, but Sarah was already turning away, looking toward the horizon where storm clouds were building like dark promises. "Weather's turning," she said. "You'd best come inside before it breaks. Least I could do is feed you before you ride on." As she walked toward the cabin, moving with that careful grace of pregnant women everywhere, Aiyana stood frozen in the settling dust among the dead men and their scattered weapons. The wind whispered around him, carrying secrets and memories and the sound of his brother's true name, spoken in a woman's voice like a ghost calling across the years. He followed her toward the cabin, each step carrying him closer to a truth that would change everything he thought he knew about loss, about family, and about the cruel mathematics of fate that could bring a man face to face with his own blood without him even knowing it. She invited him to her table as a grateful stranger, but every scar on her fence post told him a story that made his blood run cold. The storm that had threatened never came, leaving the prairie to bake under 3 days of relentless sun as Sarah McKenna and her unlikely protector made their way across the endless grassland. She rode in a buckboard wagon that had seen better years, its wheels groaning protests against every rut and stone, while Aiyana kept pace on his paint horse, always scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. They spoke little during the journey. Sarah seemed lost in thoughts too heavy for words, one hand resting on her swollen belly while the other held the reins with practiced ease. Aiyana found himself stealing glances at her profile, searching for something he couldn't name in the determined set of her jaw and the way she held her shoulders despite the wagon's constant jostling. When they finally crested the last rise and her homestead spread out below them, Aiyana felt his breath catch in his throat like a man who had walked into a spider's web. The cabin sat in a shallow valley where a creek wound between cottonwoods that had grown tall enough to offer real shade. It was a good spot, protected from the worst winds and close to water, the kind of place a man would choose if he planned to stay, to build something that might last. But it was the fence that made Aiyana's hands tighten on his reins. Carved into the weathered posts were marks he recognized, symbols cut deep into the wood with the tip of a knife. Not random scratches, but deliberate signs, a hawk in flight, a mountain peak, a crescent moon cradled in cupped hands. Symbols that meant home, protection, and safe harbor in the language his people carve into trees to mark their passage through the world. Symbols his brother Nailnish had been carving since boyhood. "Thomas built all this himself," Sarah said, her voice carrying the pride and pain of memory. "Took him 2 summers to get the cabin finished, but he wouldn't let me help with the heavy work. Said a man should build his own shelter for his family." She smiled, but it was a fragile thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. Stubborn as a mule, he was. Aiyana said nothing, but his gaze moved from post to post, counting the familiar marks like a man counting his own heartbeats. There were others too, signs he didn't recognize, symbols that seemed to blend Apache meaning with something else, as if 2 languages had been woven together by someone trying to build a bridge between worlds. They stopped before the cabin, and Aiyana dismounted to help Sarah down from the wagon. She accepted his assistance with the careful grace of a woman who had learned to balance pride with necessity, her hand briefly resting on his arm as she found her footing on solid ground. "It's not much," she said, looking at her home through his eyes. "But it's mine, ours." Her hand moved to her belly again in that protective gesture he was learning to recognize. For now, anyway, the cabin was larger than it had appeared from a distance, built with the kind of careful attention that spoke of a man who knew how to work with wood and stone. The logs were chinked tight against winter winds, and the roof showed signs of recent repair. A small garden struggled against the late-season drought, but someone had been tending it with love and limited water. Inside, the single room was clean and spare, furnished with pieces that had been made by hand rather than bought from any store. A table that bore the marks of careful craftsmanship, chairs that fit together without nails, shelves that held books and dishes and small treasures with equal reverence. But it was the wall above the fireplace that stopped Aiyana cold. Hanging there, crossed like swords above a hearth that had warmed countless evenings, were 2 objects that made his vision blur with recognition. A bow, carved from Osage orange and strung with sinew, its grip worn smooth by familiar hands. And beside it, a knife in a beaded sheath, Apache work, made by their grandmother's patient fingers before arthritis stole her skill. Sarah followed his gaze, and her face softened with memory. Thomas said those belonged to his people, said they were a gift from his family before he had to leave them behind. She moved to the fireplace and touched the bow's grip with gentle fingers. He taught me to shoot with this. Said a woman alone should know how to feed herself and fight for herself. Did he? Aiyana's voice came out rough as sand, and he had to clear his throat before continuing. Did he speak of his family often? Sarah's hand stilled on the bow, and for a moment the only sound in the cabin was the whisper of wind through the chinks in the log walls. When she turned to face him, her eyes held the weight of someone who had carried secrets too long. Every night, she said quietly. In his sleep, he'd call out names in his own language. Sometimes he'd wake up crying, and I'd hold him until the dreams passed. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. He loved them, whoever they were, left them behind, but never stopped loving them. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither dared cross. Aiyana stared at the weapons that had once belonged to his brother, while Sarah watched him with eyes that seemed to see more than she was saying. Outside, his paint horse nickered softly, and the sound broke the spell that had settled over them both. "You'll stay for supper," Sarah said, and it wasn't quite a question. "It's the least I can do after what you did for me." They worked together as the sun sank toward the horizon, Sarah moving around her kitchen with the efficient grace of a woman who had learned to make much from little, while Aiyana split wood for her fire and tended to both horses. The familiarity of simple tasks helped ease the strange tension that had sprung up between them, though he found his eyes drawn again and again to those carved fence posts and the weapons above her hearth. The meal was simple, beans and cornbread, with wild green Sarah had gathered from along the creek, but it tasted better than anything Aiyana had eaten in months. Maybe it was the company, or maybe it was the way Sarah insisted on serving him first, treating him not as a savage who had wandered out of the wilderness, but as a guest worthy of her best efforts. "Thomas used to say the same thing," she murmured, watching him clean his plate with obvious appreciation. "Said I could make shoe leather taste good if I put my mind to it." "He was a lucky man," Aiyana said, and meant it. Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Lucky? Yes, I suppose dying young and far from home counts as lucky, if you look at it right." She pushed food around her plate without eating, her appetite apparently deserting her as the conversation turned toward painful ground. The men who killed him, they said he had no right to live among white folks, said his kind should stay where they belonged. The fork in Aiyana's hand bent slightly under the pressure of his grip. They knew he was Apache. They suspected. Thomas could pass for Mexican when he had to, or maybe Spanish if the light was right. But there was something about him. She gestured vaguely, searching for words. The way he moved, maybe, or how he always knew which way the wind was blowing. Little things that added up to the truth for those who cared to look. After supper, they sat on the cabin's small porch and watched the stars emerge from the darkening sky. The child in Sarah's belly kicked restlessly, and she placed Aiyana's calloused hand against the spot where tiny feet pressed against her skin. "He's active tonight," she said with a smile that held genuine warmth. Thomas used to talk to him, tell him stories about his people and the places he'd seen. Said every child should know where he comes from, even if the world doesn't want him to claim it. Under Aiyana's palm, the baby moved again, a strong kick that spoke of health and determination. The sensation sent something through him that he couldn't name, a combination of wonder, recognition, and a grief so deep it threatened to drown him where he sat. "What will you call him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know yet. Thomas and I talked about names, but we never settled on any." She looked up at the stars, which had come out in their full glory now that the sun was gone. He wanted to give him an Apache name, something that would honor his heritage. "But I'm not sure I'd say it right." Aiyana felt the child move again under his hand, and for just a moment he could swear he felt something else, a presence, a warmth that reminded him of his brother's laughter and the way Nailnish used to place his hand on Aiyana's shoulder when words weren't enough. Names have power, he said carefully. They shape who we become, how the world sees us. Your husband was wise to think about such things. Sarah studied his profile in the starlight, and he could feel the weight of her attention like a physical thing. You speak like you knew him, she said softly. The way you talk about Apache ways, about names and family. It's like you're remembering instead of explaining. The question hung in the air between them, delicate and dangerous as morning frost. Aiyana could feel himself standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that his next words would either carry him safely across or send him tumbling into an abyss that would change everything. Instead of answering, he stood up and walked to the nearest fence post, running his fingers over the carved symbols until he found the one that made his heart stop. A thunderbird with outstretched wings, cut deep into the wood with the patient precision of someone who had carved the same symbol 1,000 times before. His brother's mark. The sign Nailnish had been carving into trees and stones and anything that would hold still long enough since they were children playing in the shadow of distant mountains. Sarah had followed him, moving with the careful steps of a pregnant woman navigating uncertain ground. She stood beside him in the darkness, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used and feel the warmth radiating from her skin. He carved that one the day we were married, she said quietly. So that would protect our home from evil spirits and bad luck. Her voice caught slightly. I asked him what it meant, but he just smiled and said some things were better shown than explained. Aiyana traced the thunderbird's wings with one finger, feeling the familiar curves and angles that his brother's hands had shaped. The wood was smooth now, worn by weather and time, but the symbol remained as clear as the day it was cut. Sarah, he began, then stopped. The words he needed didn't exist in English, or maybe they existed but were too heavy for his tongue to carry. How did you tell a woman that the child she carried was your blood? How did you explain that her dead husband was the brother you had been searching for across 2 long winters of grief and unanswered questions? She waited, patient as stone, while he struggled with truths too large for speaking. Finally, he turned away from the fence post and met her eyes. In the starlight, her face was pale and expectant, but not afraid. Whatever she saw in his expression, it didn't frighten her. Tomorrow, he said, the word feeling like a promise and a threat all at once. Tomorrow we'll talk. He delivered his brother's son with his own hands and watched a woman's heart break when she realized what love had cost them both. November came to the prairie like a thief in the night, stealing the last warmth from the days and leaving frost patterns on the cabin windows that looked like the delicate bones of winter birds. The first snow fell on a Tuesday, soft flakes that drifted down like ash from some distant fire, and Aiyana knew with the certainty of a man who had lived his whole life reading the sky's moods that Sarah's time was drawing near. She had grown heavy and slow in the weeks since his arrival, her belly round as a harvest moon and her back curved under the weight she carried. But there was something else in her movements now, a restless energy that reminded him of Mares about to foal or does seeking hidden places to birth their young. She would stand at the window for long minutes, one hand pressed to her side, her green eyes focused on something only she could see. Aiyana had not left the homestead since that night. They sat under the stars, and he promised her tomorrow would bring explanations. Tomorrow had stretched into weeks, then months, and still he found reasons to delay the conversation that would change everything between them. He chopped wood that didn't need chopping, mended fence posts that were already sound, and told himself he was staying because Apache honor demanded he protect the woman he had saved. The truth was both simpler and more complex than honor. He was falling in love with his brother's widow, and the child she carried was his own blood. The realization had come to him gradually, like dawn creeping across the eastern horizon. It lived in the way Sarah hummed while she cooked, the same melody Nailnish had whistled while working. It showed itself in the careful way she arranged her few possessions, creating beauty from nothing the way their grandmother had taught both boys when they were small. It whispered to him in the Apache words she had learned to speak correctly, pronunciation too perfect for someone who had learned them from books or traders. She knew. Part of her had always known, just as part of him had recognized her from that first moment in the cabin doorway. They were two people walking around a truth too large and terrible to acknowledge, like dancers circling a fire that might either warm them or burn them alive. The labor pains began just after midnight on a night when the wind howled like lost spirits around the cabin's corners. Aiyana woke to the sound of Sarah's gasp, sharp and desperate in the darkness, followed by the creak of rope springs as she struggled to sit up in her bed. "It's time," she whispered, and her voice carried both fear and determination in equal measure. Aiyana was beside her before the words had fully left her lips, his hands gentle but sure as he helped her stand. She gripped his arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging into his flesh as another wave of pain rolled through her body. "How long?" he asked, and she managed a shaky laugh. "Been coming and going for hours. Didn't want to wake you until—" Another contraction cut off her words, bending her forward as she breathed through the pain with the focused intensity of a warrior preparing for battle. What followed was a night that would burn itself into Aiyana's memory like a brand pressed into living flesh. He had assisted at births before. Apache women considered it natural for men to help bring new life into the world, but this was different. This was Sarah, fighting to bring his brother's child into a world that had no place for him. And Aiyana was the only one there to help her through the darkest hours before dawn. He built up the fire until the cabin glowed with warmth and light, then helped Sarah into the birthing position his grandmother had shown him years ago. She knelt on folded blankets, her hands gripping the back of a chair while he supported her from behind, his voice steady and calm even as his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. "Breathe," he murmured in Apache, the words coming naturally in the language of his childhood. "Let the pain flow through you like water over stone. Don't fight it. Let it do its work." Sarah nodded, sweat beading on her forehead despite the winter cold that pressed against the cabin's walls. Thomas used to say that she gasped between contractions, said Apache women were the strongest in the world because they knew how to bend without breaking. The hours crawled by with the painful slowness of wounded animals. Sarah labored with the fierce determination of her pioneer stock, refusing to cry out even when the contractions came so close together that she barely had time to breathe between them. Aiyana stayed with her through it all, his hands offering support when she needed it, his voice providing the steady stream of encouragement that his grandmother had used to guide countless Apache women through their birthing journeys. As the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the cabin windows, Sarah's waters broke in a rush of fluid that soaked the blankets beneath her. She looked up at Aiyana, with eyes wide with exhaustion and something approaching panic. "Something's wrong," she whispered. "It should be happening faster now, shouldn't it?" Aiyana moved around to face her, his hands gentle but firm as he examined her condition. The baby was coming, but slowly, as if reluctant to leave the warm safety of his mother's womb for the uncertain world beyond. Sarah's strength was flagging, her face pale with effort and loss of blood. "The baby's fine," he told her, though his own heart was racing with concern. "But he's being cautious like his father. We need to help him along." For the next hour, Aiyana guided Sarah through the final stages of labor with skills learned at his grandmother's side and refined through years of helping Apache women birth their children. He positioned her body to make the baby's passage easier, supported her when she needed to push, and spoke to both mother and child in the ancient words that had eased Apache birth for generations beyond counting. When the baby's head finally crowned, dark hair slick with birth fluids, Aiyana felt something crack open in his chest like an egg releasing a bird to flight. The child's features, even swollen and distorted from birth, were unmistakably familiar. The broad forehead, the strong chin, the way his tiny fists clenched with determined fury, all of it spoke of Nailnish's bloodline as clearly as if his brother had signed his name across the baby's face. "One more push," Aiyana urged, his voice thick with emotions he couldn't name. "He's almost here." Sarah gathered her remaining strength and bore down with everything she had left, her body doing what women's bodies had done since the world began. The baby slipped free in a rush of fluid and blood, and Aiyana caught him in hands that trembled with awe and recognition. The child was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs that announced his displeasure with the cold world by filling the cabin with his outraged cries. But it was his skin that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Copper brown and unmistakably Apache, marked with the heritage his father had tried so hard to hide. Aiyana cleaned the baby with gentle efficiency, his movements automatic while his mind struggled to process what was happening. This was his nephew, his brother's son, flesh of his flesh and blood of his blood. The child Nailnish would never see, never hold, never teach to hunt and ride and read the language of wind and weather. When he placed the baby in Sarah's arms, she looked down at her son with eyes that held wonder and heartbreak in equal measure. Her finger traced the infant's cheek, so dark against her pale skin, and Aiyana saw the exact moment when understanding flooded through her like a dam bursting. "Oh God," she whispered, and tears began streaming down her face. "Oh, Thomas, what did we do?" The baby quieted at his mother's touch, his tiny fist wrapping around her finger with the instinctive grip of the newborn. But Sarah wasn't looking at her son anymore. Her eyes were fixed on Aiyana's face, reading there the truth they had both been dancing around for months. "You're his brother," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Nailnish. That was his real name, wasn't it?" "Nailnish." Aiyana nodded, not trusting his voice to carry words through the tightness in his throat. "He talked about you," Sarah continued, her voice breaking on every word. "In his sleep, mostly. He'd call out for someone named Aiyana, beg him to forgive whatever he'd done wrong." She looked down at the baby again, fresh tears falling onto his dark hair. "He loved you so much. Missed you every day of the 3 years we had together. Why didn't he come home?" The question tore itself from Aiyana's chest like a physical thing. "Why didn't he tell me he was alive?" Sarah's laugh held no humor, only the bitter sound of dreams turned to ash. "Because he knew what it would mean. An Apache warrior married to a white woman with a half-breed child? They would have killed all 3 of us, and probably burned your whole village for good measure." She wiped her eyes with the back of her free hand, leaving streaks in the dirt and sweat that covered her face. "He chose love over blood, and it killed him anyway." The silence that fell over the cabin was broken only by the baby's soft breathing and the whisper of snow against the windows. Aiyana sat back on his heels, looking at the woman and child who had become the most important people in his world, and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him like stones. "What was he like?" he asked finally. "As Thomas, I mean. Was he happy?" Sarah smiled through her tears, and for a moment her face was transformed by the memory of love freely given and gratefully received. "He was the happiest man I ever knew, right up until the day they killed him. He'd sing while he worked, dance with me in the evenings, even when we were both too tired to stand. He said he'd found something worth more than all the gold in California." She shifted the baby to her other arm, and Aiyana saw how naturally the child settled against her breast, already seeking the nourishment only she could provide. "He made me promise," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, "that if anything happened to him, I'd find a way to tell his family about the baby. Said every Apache child deserved to know where he came from, even if the world tried to take that knowledge away." The baby stirred in her arms, making the small sounds that newborns make when they're testing their voices against the vast silence of existence. Aiyana reached out without thinking, letting the child wrap his tiny fingers around his thumb, and felt a connection snap into place that was stronger than blood, deeper than bone. "What will you call him?" he asked, the same question he had posed months ago under different stars and with different knowledge. Sarah looked up at him, her green eyes steady despite the tears that still tracked down her cheeks. "I thought, if it's all right with you, I'd call him Aiyana. After his uncle, who came to save us both." The name hit him like an arrow to the chest, carrying with it all the weight of Apache tradition and the responsibility of naming. In his culture, To give a child someone's name was to bind them together across time and distance, to ensure that one would live on in the other, even after death claimed them both. It means eternal blossom, he said quietly. I know. Sarah's smile was soft and sad and beautiful. Thomas taught me that. Said it was the most beautiful word in any language, because it promised that some things last forever, no matter how much the world tries to destroy them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the prairie in white silence and covering the tracks of all who had passed this way before. Inside the cabin, three people who had been brought together by love and loss and the strange mathematics of fate sat in the warm glow of firelight, learning how to be a family in a world that would never accept what they had become. The baby, Aiyana, slept in his mother's arms, unaware that his birth had changed everything for the adults who watched over him. He was Apache and white, beloved and unwanted, a bridge between worlds that might never learn to meet in peace. But for now, in this moment, he was simply perfect, and that was enough. She pressed his dead brother's ring into his hands and asked him to take their son home, to a people who might never accept what love had created. Spring came to the Kansas prairie like a promise whispered in the dark, bringing with it the scent of rain-washed earth and new grass pushing through the soil that had slept beneath winter's blanket. The cottonwoods along the creek burst into fresh green leaf, and meadowlarks returned to sing their liquid songs from fence posts that still bore the carved marks of a man who had tried to build a bridge between two worlds. Little Aiyana was 4 months old now, a sturdy child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. He had grown strong on his mother's milk and a love that surrounded him like armor against a world that would never fully accept what he represented. When he laughed, which was often, the sound filled the cabin with a joy that made even the simplest moments feel touched by something sacred. Sarah had bloomed in motherhood the way prairie flowers bloomed after rain, finding strength she hadn't known she possessed and wisdom that seemed to flow from some deep well of female knowing. She spoke to her son in both English and the Apache words Aiyana had taught her, weaving together the languages of his heritage like threads in a blanket meant to keep him warm through whatever storms might come. Sure, yeah, she would murmur as she rocked him to sleep, using the Apache word for my son that Aiyana had whispered to her on the night of his birth. Shima loves you. Your uncle loves you. Your father, wherever his spirit walks now, he loves you too. Aiyana had built himself a small shelter behind the cabin, a simple structure that gave Sarah privacy while keeping him close enough to protect her and the child. He told himself it was temporary, just until she was strong enough to manage alone or until he could find her a safe passage to relatives somewhere back east. But as the weeks turned to months and spring painted the world in shades of hope, he began to admit to himself that he had no intention of leaving. This was his family now. Not the family he had been born into, but the one fate had given him through loss and love and the strange mathematics of blood that could tie strangers together across time and distance. He was uncle, protector, and something more, the keeper of his brother's memory and the guardian of his brother's son's future. The child was Apache. There could be no question of that, despite his white mother and his uncertain place in either world. His skin bore the copper tone of desert sun. His hair grew thick and black as raven wings, and when he cried, which was rare, his voice carried the same strong note that had marked Nailnish as a baby destined for greatness. But it was more than physical resemblance that marked little Aiyana as one of the people. He seemed to know things that couldn't be taught, reaching for objects before they came into view, calming at the sound of Apache lullabies, turning his head to follow the flight of hawks, as if their paths held meaning only he could read. He has the sight, Aiyana told Sarah one evening as they watched the baby track the movement of clouds across the sunset sky. My grandmother would have said he was born with 1 foot in each world, this one and the spirit realm where his father walks. Sarah shifted the child in her arms, her face thoughtful in the dying light. Is it a blessing or a curse? Both, Aiyana answered honestly. as most true gifts are. They have fallen into routines that felt as natural as breathing. Aiyana would rise before dawn to check the horses and scan the horizon for signs of trouble, while Sarah prepared their simple breakfast and nursed the baby in the golden light that slanted through the cabin's east window. They worked together during the day, he mending fence and tending the small herd of cattle that had somehow survived the winter, she maintaining the garden and the endless tasks that kept a frontier household running. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the stars emerge, the baby often sleeping between them, while they shared the comfortable silence of people who had learned to trust each other with their deepest fears and most precious hopes. Sometimes Sarah would ask about Apache customs, and Aiyana would find himself telling stories his grandmother had shared, tales of how the people had learned to live in harmony with the land and sky and all the creatures that shared their world. "When he's older," Sarah said one night, her hand resting on the baby's chest to feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, "will you teach him to hunt? If you want me to. I want him to know everything. Apache ways, white ways, everything that might help him survive in whatever world he chooses to claim." Her voice carried the fierce protectiveness of a mother preparing her child for battles she couldn't fight for him. Thomas always said the strongest people were those who could walk between worlds without losing themselves. It was during the third week of May that the traders came, 3 weathered men driving a wagon loaded with goods they hoped to sell to isolated homesteaders. They were harmless enough, more interested in profit than politics, but they carried news that changed everything. "Heard tell there's Apache bands gathering down near the Cimarron," the eldest of them said as he examined Sarah's few trade goods. "Some kind of council, from what the soldiers at Fort Dodge were saying. Looking for warriors who went missing during the last round of fighting." Aiyana felt something cold settle in his stomach like a stone dropped into still water. Missing warriors? Mostly young men who disappeared after the Battle of Adobe Walls. Army figured they were dead, but word is some might have gone aground, maybe taken up with other tribes, or... The man's gaze flicked to Sarah and the baby she held. "Well, you hear stories. Indians trying to pass for Mexican, that sort of thing." After the traders left, Aiyana and Sarah sat in silence while the baby played with a rattle carved from deer antler. The news had opened a door neither of them wanted to walk through, but they both knew they couldn't pretend it didn't exist. "They're looking for you," Sarah said finally. "Maybe, not maybe. They're looking for you, and eventually they're going to find you. Or soldiers will, or bounty hunters, or someone else who thinks there's profit in bringing back Apache warriors to whatever passes for justice these days." She looked down at her son, who had fallen asleep clutching his toy. "What happens to us then?" Aiyana had no answer for her, because the truth was too complex for words. If he returned to his people, he would have to explain where he had been for the past year, why he had chosen to live among whites instead of continuing his search for his brother. Some would understand, but others would see his choices as betrayal, his love for Sarah and the baby as weakness that dishonored Apache ways. If he stayed, he would eventually be found, and Sarah would pay the price for harboring him. She would be branded an Indian lover, driven from her home, possibly killed along with the child whose mixed blood marked him as an abomination in the eyes of those who believe the races should remain forever separate. Either choice led to loss. The only question was who would suffer most. That night, as Aiyana lay in his shelter listening to the sounds of the prairie settling into sleep, he made his decision. It wasn't the choice his heart wanted, but it was the one his love demanded. In the morning, he would begin preparing Sarah and the baby for a journey. Not east to her family. That would only delay the inevitable, but south to the gathering his people were calling along the Cimarron. It was time for little Aiyana to meet his father's family, and time for his uncle to come home. He rose before dawn and found Sarah already awake, nursing the baby by the light of the fire she had built up against the morning chill. She looked up as he entered, and he saw in her eyes that she had reached the same conclusion he had. "When do we leave?" she asked. "We..." Sarah's smile held all the fierce determination that had helped her survive alone on the frontier through pregnancy, childbirth, and the daily challenges of making a life from nothing. Did you think I was going to let you take my son away from me? This baby is all I have left of Thomas, and I'm not letting him go into that world without someone to speak for his white mother's love. Sarah, you don't understand what you're asking. My people, some of them won't accept you. Won't accept him. There could be violence. There's violence everywhere for people like us. At least with your family, there's a chance of understanding. She shifted the baby to her shoulder, her movements gentle but her voice strong with resolve. Thomas chose love over safety every day we were together. I won't dishonor his memory by choosing differently now. They spent the next 2 weeks preparing for the journey, selling what they couldn't carry and packing the essentials into bundles that could be secured to the horses. Sarah proved surprisingly practical about what to take and what to leave behind, keeping only the things that held true meaning. Her mother's Bible, Thomas's bow and knife, a few pieces of clothing that could be mended and remade as needed. On the morning they were to depart, she disappeared into the cabin alone and emerged carrying a small leather pouch that she pressed into Aiyana's hands. This was Thomas's, she said quietly, his wedding ring. He wore it on a cord around his neck because he was afraid wearing it on his finger would mark him as married to a white woman. She closed his fingers around the pouch. I want you to have it. Not to wear, but to carry. So you'll remember that love like ours is possible, even in a world that tries to make it impossible. Aiyana opened the pouch and found himself looking at a simple gold band, worn smooth by years of being worried between nervous fingers. Inside the band, barely visible in the morning light, were 2 names etched in careful script, Thomas and Sarah, followed by a date in the spring of 1868. He bought it with money he earned breaking horses for a rancher near Dodge City, Sarah continued. Saved for 3 months to afford something that wasn't much more than a circle of soft metal. But to him, it represented everything he'd never thought he could have: a home, a wife, a future that belonged to him instead of to the wars and hatred that had shaped his past. Aiyana closed the pouch and tucked it inside his shirt, where it rested against his heart like a talisman. I'll keep it safe. I know you will. And someday, when little Aiyana is old enough to understand what it means, you'll give it to him. So he'll know that his parents' love was real, even if the world they lived in wasn't ready for it. The journey south took them through country that grew more familiar with each mile, past landmarks Aiyana remembered from his youth, and into the heart of the land that had shaped both him and his brother. Sarah rode beside him without complaint, the baby secured in a carrier that kept him close to her heart while leaving her hands free to manage her horse. They traveled slowly, stopping often to rest and nurse the child, making camp early each evening to give Sarah time to recover from the day's riding. At night, Aiyana would build small fires that gave warmth without advertising their presence, while Sarah prepared simple meals and sang lullabies that blended English words with Apache melodies. It was during their 4th night on the trail that they heard the drums. The sound came to them on the evening wind like the heartbeat of the earth itself, rhythmic and deep and unmistakably Apache. Aiyana rose from their fire and walked to the edge of their small camp, listening with senses trained from childhood to read meaning in the patterns of sound that carried across the darkness. They're close, he told Sarah when he returned. Maybe 5 miles to the south. The drums are calling the clans together for council. Sarah nodded, but he could see the fear she was trying to hide behind her mask of calm determination. Tomorrow would bring them to the gathering, and both their lives would change forever. What will you tell them? She asked. About Thomas, I mean. About us. The truth. Aiyana settled beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough away to preserve the careful distance they had maintained throughout their journey. That my brother found love in an unexpected place, and that love gave him a son who carries the blood of 2 peoples. That you are his widow and the mother of his child, and that both of you deserve the protection of his family. And if they don't accept us? Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire dance and listening to the distant drums that called to something deep in his blood. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of promises that could not be broken. Then we'll make our own family, our own tribe. You, me, and little Aiyana. We'll find a place where love matters more than the color of our skin, and we'll build something new from the ashes of what the old world tried to destroy. Sarah reached across the space between them and took his hand, her fingers warm against his palm. For the first time since they had met, the careful distance they maintained seemed less important than the connection that bound them together. Not as man and woman, but as two people united in their love for the child who slept between them and their determination to give him a future worthy of his father's dreams. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly, "I'm glad we found each other. Glad Thomas led you to us, even if he had to die to do it." The drums continued through the night, calling the scattered children of the desert home to their people. And in a small camp beneath the endless stars, three souls who had been brought together by loss and bound together by love prepared to face whatever morning would bring, knowing that they carried within themselves the seeds of hope that could bloom even in the harshest ground. In the distance, the drums spoke of gathering, of reunion, of the ancient rhythms that connected all Apache hearts across time and space. But in their camp, the only sound was the soft breathing of a sleeping child who would wake tomorrow to meet his father's people and claim his place in a story that was still being written in the dust and wind and silence of the endless prairie.